Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Lev Rosen about Rough Pages. Lev is an Anthony and a Lambda Literary finalist and a McCavity Award winner for Lavender House, which is the first book in this series. And this is book number 3. Welcome, Lev. Good to see you again.
Hi. Good seeing you again. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Can you give the audience an overview of what Rough Pages is about?
Yeah, Rough Pages is the third, as you said, in the series. And at this point, Andy has sort of established a bit of a life. He's the detective for the queer community in 1950 San Francisco. And he's been helping people and making up for his time as a cop. And one of his old friends, Pat, who was the butler at Lavender House, calls him back to Lavender House, or he sees everyone, but he wants Andy to look into some missing booksellers. And the reason Pat is worried is because these booksellers, this bookstore, ran a book service, which were sort of like the 1950s version of book boxes, where you would sign up and you'd get sent a bunch of books. And in this case, it was a queer book service, which were things that existed in the 50s. This is based on an actual book service. And because the booksellers have gone missing, he's afraid that the feds have called them in or have brought them in because the Postal Service would sue these book services for sending inappropriate materials to the mail, and arrested these booksellers, and most importantly, gotten a hold of the list of subscribers, which Pat is on. And because the family at Lavender House is just finalizing an adoption, knowing that they employ a homosexual could get their child taken away. And so that is how Andy gets brought into looking for these missing booksellers, and that soon involves maybe the Postal Service and the feds, maybe the mafia. And the whole time, there is a reporter sniffing around the case as well. And she remembers Andy from when he was a cop and wants to know why he left the force, which is a secret that could put all of his cases in jeopardy.
So you give us an entire box of goodies to unpack in this, which is always so wonderful. That's something that you do. There are always little treasures here and there throughout your book. And one of the things, a compliment I'm going to pay you, is you do a lot of research on what was popular during that year. This one is set in 1952. And of course, the 50s is my favorite music. So of course, every singer you mentioned, I of course go and look up, was that the right year? And of course you did a great job at that, Lev, and I knew you would. But it's that attention to detail, which is always so much fun in reading your work, because you give us these little nuggets that you've researched, and so they're right.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I do try to do as much research as possible. I don't get everything right, as someone will inevitably email me about. But I do try my best, and the music is really fun, and also pretty easy to look up generally, which is nice. But I compose a whole playlist that I listen to of the songs that I use or want to use, and that sort of, I'm listening to that while I'm writing, so I'm trying to get that vibe.
I love it. And because it is my favorite genre of music. I'm a music collector. And so, of course, I knew all of the songs, and I was very excited about it because I felt like I was right there with Andy. As Andy was telling me what was going on, I was like, okay, I can dig this because I understand this. So.
Yeah, and Andy is like a music guy. He recognizes songs. It's really it's just, yeah, I love the music from that period as well. And it's so much fun to find a way to bring it in. And then, of course, in every book, I have tried to include lyrics, which is very difficult because not everything is public domain yet. So that usually requires a lot more research because I have to find a song that was popular in the 50s, but was originally like written in the 20s or 30s. But so far I've done it for every book.
I love that. I love that. And of course, San Francisco plays such a large role in this particular series. And you give us the fog and you give us the smells and the stuff, and that's always so much fun. And I do want to talk a little bit, you hit on it, but I do want to talk a little bit about the mail service, and something we take so for granted today. You can log on to a bunch of different booksellers around the world and have anything you want delivered to you within reason. But that was not the case even into the 50s and maybe even the 60s, that anything that was of gay orientation or LGBTQ plus had to go out on the down low because there were so many laws against that. You want to talk a little bit about that?
It's interesting. I think of it as sort of, it was both everywhere and nowhere, and it's one of those things where so the Corey book service was the big one that I modeled this one on, but there were a lot of smaller queer book services. But what's interesting is that in the 50s there were many gay books, and this isn't even, we think of this sort of like queer pulps, but that's later 50s and early 60s usually, and then you get into the 70s where they're really raunchy. But there were many gay books coming out in the 50s, and a lot of them were bestsellers. They were doing really well. People were talking about this stuff, were interested in queer stories. They often did not end happily. There were very few books in the 50s about queer people that ends with them, living happily ever after. But there were many gay books, and they did do very well, and they were legal. You could go into a store and buy them. Sending them through the mail was where it got complicated, and that's because there were laws against sort of sending pornographic materials through the mail, and what was pornographic was often up for debate. So the Corey book service did get sued by the postal service, and there was a large fine at the time. Like, I think it was like $3,000, but like at the time, oh my God. And there was jail time threatened. And what that did is all these publishers, there were smaller publishers that put out all these gay books. They all sort of closed up shop or stopped putting out gay books for a couple of years, and the book service had to shut down because they ran out of books. But then a year or so later, they all started back up again, and so did this book service. It didn't end until the 6th. I have to check that. Part of me wants to say the 60s, and part of me wants to say the 80s. But let's say the 70s.
We'll meet in the middle.
It went on for a very long time, this book service, and gay books like continued to be published for a long time. And, this was part of culture. The idea that gay media is like new or something is something that people are always trying to tell us, and is always a lie, like almost always a lie. Like, you can go back to the 20s and the pansy craze, where there were like, everyone was going to gay bars to see the gay people because it was so much fun, and they were showing up in movies. Like, this is something that has been, like, we've been part of culture. We are part of culture. And the idea that we're not is ridiculous. You look at the first review in the New York Times of a gay YA novel happened a couple months before Stonewall. Like, wow. This is history that people are constantly trying to erase, and it exists, and it's so fun to be able to get it out there in the form of like a fun mystery.
And I love it because, as you mentioned in the acknowledgments, you referenced several books that were out during that time, that were, out in the world. They weren't hiding.
Yeah, fully relied on Michael Bronski's Pulp Friction, which like catalogs so many of these books, these queer books, because many of them are out of print, but he reprints like a chapter or two from all of them. So I got to dip into a lot of them.
Well, and it's so interesting because I know about this and I know about the services. I even know that in the late 70s and early 80s, if you ordered the magazine RFD, which was a fairy magazine, it came in a brown envelope, no return address on it, nothing to identify what it was, because even in the 80s and 90s, there were people that lived in rural areas who wanted to subscribe to this, but did not want their postal service worker to know their business. And because not everyone is out. I mean, we live in a world where we're much more fortunate that we can be out now, but that is a hard battle for some people still today. And that's difficult to, but it's nice to know that, as you say, we've been around. We ain't new. We're not a new phenomena. We've been entertaining the world for years.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I also know that the mafia figured into a lot of queer history, in the fact that the mafia owned a lot of queer bars and a lot of queer bookstores. Yeah. And it's one of those things that it's sort of hard to say. We grew up with this idea that we should always trust the police, yet the police were always raiding something that wasn't mafia owned, because the mafia made sure they didn't raid theirs, but those that weren't mafia owned were often raided. And you look at the abuse at the hands of law enforcement, who can we trust? And that, of course, is something that figures into your book as well. Do you trust law enforcement? Do you trust the mafia? And of course, Andy, he's sort of in the middle road there, because he's gay, and he doesn't know who to trust because he's been done wrong by both of them.
Yeah, no, I didn't get into so much of the mafia owning bars, although that was certainly interesting. But I did get into the way that the mafia sort of regarded queer folks, which was sort of like, you're not something to take advantage of. That's I think is how they viewed it. You look at Stonewall, which, like I said, was owned by the mafia, and because of that, they were allowed, they didn't care about owning a gay bar. They didn't care about the queer people, as long as they could make money off them. Although they did also blackmail people. It's sort of like, and that's one of the fears of the mafia getting a hold of the list in this book, is they're going to blackmail everyone. So it's like, okay, do you want to be blackmailed, or do you want the government to take you away? Like, it's having to hide this list and these people became so key, because it was just so dangerous then to be identified. You could lose so much. And Andy is interesting because he has lost so much already. And that gives him a certain freedom.
Which I think is a beautiful thing, because, I know if you lost everything, it's easy just to retreat into nothingness and stay there because you've already suffered your loss. So that's, of course, one of the things that's so endearing about Andy is, he does stick up for his friends. And there's one point in the book that Andy says that, he's much more interested in protecting his friends and loved ones than worrying about himself. And I think you tapped into something there so eloquently, because Andy's already lost, and he sort of feels like he's behind the 8 ball, and he's trying to do his best for his friends so they don't suffer the losses that he's suffered. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think Andy, when we first met him at the start of Lavender House, Andy was fully suicidal, like planning it out. And so having him get to find this life that he did not expect, and realize that it was here the whole time, and he was, sort of a participant in making it difficult for people, means that he feels he has a lot to make up for a start, and also that he has to find the thing that he's going to lose again, and he's just starting to do that in this one, which is why I think we don't want to get into spoiler territory, but like he does do something sort of foolhardy and brave, and there are conversations with his boyfriend Gene about this idea of Andy always trying to rescue everyone in this one, and how he needs to let himself get rescued sometimes, or he needs to let people handle themselves. He needs to stop putting himself in danger willy-nilly as though he has nothing to lose, because these people who care about him can lose him. And I think that is something that he has to figure out over the course of this book.
And I like that, because I think, we go along with Andy. As readers, we want to root for the protagonist. We want them to win. But we see Andy's evolution, and we go on the ride with him, because you don't fool us. You don't surprise. Well, surprises, yes, but I mean, you don't fool us into thinking one thing and then switching up on us. We feel like, at least me, this reader feels like Andy's my buddy. So I'm going with Andy wherever Andy goes. So I think you've nailed that for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. I think Andy's a good guy trying to do right now.
Right. I agree with that. So, I don't think you can not root for someone like that. I mean, that's what we want in a friend, and we want someone that, has our back. Andy is trying so hard to have our back,
Mm-hmm.
So I love that. And then, of course, some of the things that are sort of said, if you've read all three, they all stand as a standalone. They just happen to be the same characters. But we see some things that I'm assuming down the road there'll be some deal with Andy and his mom. So, it's one of those things that you set up these things for me to at least expect. You don't have to say yes or no, Lev.
No, I'm happy to. I mean, the cover for the fourth one was just revealed, and it's pretty clear that he goes down to LA. If you read anything about and he sees mom, he visits mom in book 4. So yeah,
good.
It's all been laid in there.
All right, I love it. I also want to give a little shout out to the publisher as well. So in Lev's books, we get, what do you call this thing?
End pages.
End pages. I probably should know that by now, but I love these. And this end page is described within the book. And then this morning, as it's sitting here and I'm looking at it, I see the fish right here. I did not see the fish until just before we started recording. So people have to read the book to figure out how the fish figures into it. But that little fish, and then, of course, I love the fact that it's Lev right here.
It's not. It's not.
It is. It is.
Everyone seems to think it is. So I actually asked the artist, and it's Ava Gardner. So, I'm very flattered, but it's not me.
Oh, and now that you say that, I can totally see Ava Gardner. Who knew? I didn't know Ava had a beard, Lev. No.
There's no beard in that. No one wore beards in the 50s.
Oh, I love that.
But the cover artist, Colin Verdi, who is amazing, and Katie Klimowitz designed this one. If you look, there's so much going on that cover. If you look at it, there are pieces from previous covers on this cover. So the lavender pattern from the first cover is on one of the spine of the books. The dazzle camouflage from the second book is on one of the spines of the book. He puts so much stuff in there. And then the end papers, if you look at I'm really pleased with them, because they flat out asked me, and I said, I don't know if I could say this on your channel. And I said, it should be 2 knights, and it looks like one's about to give the other. And
that part I recognize right out, Lev. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I noticed, I'm like, well, already then, these are friendly knights.
But then if you look under the back flap at the back, there is one where they are not so friendly.
Oh, that's true. Oh my gosh.
All the books have that. They've done that in all the books, where under the back flap there is a secret.
I think that honestly, and I've seen a lot of wonderful books, I actually think your books have probably the most to tell of any I've seen. And it's always such a joy because it's happy reading. I mean, who doesn't want end pages? I mean, hello, it's just
Yeah.
exciting, something fun.
My personal mentality, I try to get stuff whenever it's a hardcover, because hardcovers are so expensive now. In my opinion, it better be worth it in some way. Like, it has to be special in a way that a paperback can't be. So I try to talk my publishers, and they always go along with it. So they've been real great about it. But I try to convince my publishers to make my hardcovers into something that feels collection worthy,
It totally is. It totally is. And some of the blurbs on this, I'll read Walter Mosley's. Rosen's smart, bittersweet tale plays with the oldest truth of all: the price we pay for identity in America. I mangled that up. I really should have practiced that before I did that. But I agree with Walter. I mean, it is the price we pay for identity in this country. We're in a place, again, we've been in the last few years where they're trying to ban books and stuff, call LGBTQ plus queer works pornography and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
How little has changed in 70 or 80 years is sad to me.
Yeah, it was weird, especially as the author of a very banned book. It was weird writing this one and being like, oh, how familiar.
Yes.
But it was also sort of hopeful, just because, like, you look, as you're looking through the history, I think I mentioned this in the author's note at the end, there was an attempt to ban Robin Hood in the 50s. Because it was too communist, and steal from the rich, never.
Right.
Similar to today. So I think that, and then there was this student group that like started up to protest that, and they were investigated by the FBI, but they still went through with everything, and like seeing that this has always been something that has been fought against too is really great.
I totally agree. Well, as always, it's such a fun time chatting with you. Again, the book is called Rough Pages. Lev, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, Lev A.C. Rosen on pretty much everything. My website is levacrosen.com. I am no longer active on Twitter, and I am trying to wean myself off meta sites. So I'm going to be doing giveaways, I think, more on Blue Sky now. That's where, but I will still be posting on Meta until I feel as though I've, successfully migrated my audience.
Totally understand. I'm in that same boat of thinking about cycling away from it. So
Yeah,
it's just crazy.
It's rough.
Lev, yes, it is. Once again, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great deal of fun.
Thank you for always having me. Always a delight.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.